What's up, everybody? This is Chris from the BrahjCast welcoming you to episode 2. My brother and I are going to interview the Beatles scholar himself, Aaron Krerowicz. He's going to drop bombs of knowledge on our heads and melt our minds with his insane expertise of the legendary and evolutionary band, the Beatles. I got nothing else to say because you know I sound stupid as hell on this microphone anyway, so let's just go ahead and start the show.
BrahjCast commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, it's good to have you on, Aaron. Just to kind of give a brief introduction, you're a professional Beatles scholar, lecturer. You
Yes.
won a research grant to study the Beatles in November 2011.
Yep.
And you kind of do some lecturing across the U.S.
Just kind of, yeah.
Just kind of.
No, it's my full-time job.
You've written a couple books.
Yes, sir.
And it's kind of a, I think you have a unique perspective. I really enjoyed your first one, The Beatles and the Avant-Garde.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so, and we'll get into some of the outline that some of the bullet points from that book that I put down, but maybe you can just kind of start out with just telling us a little bit about your, how you got to this point, how you won the research grant to study the Beatles, and kind of your passion. You know, I know it was your passion of music, but I don't want to kind of put words in your mouth, but maybe we can just kind of get the ball rolling from there.
Certainly, yeah. Well, I can't remember a time where I didn't know and love Beatles music. Because I grew up, I'm a second-generation fan. I grew up with it listening to my dad, and my dad grew up listening to it in real time. And so he grew up with the Beatles, and I grew up listening to them through him. And so as far back as I can remember, I've known and loved Beatles music. Then when I got to college, I turned more towards classical styles. My education is as a classical musician. And so I studied Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and all the major classical composers. Then at some point, I started to get back into pop music, and specifically the Beatles. And that was when I was in grad school. And I applied for and won this research grant. The way the grant worked was that the University of Hartford in Connecticut, where I was a grad student at the time, gave a little proposal saying to all the grad students, not just the musicians, but all the grad students, write up grant proposals and submit them to us, and we'll fund as many as we can. And so I wrote this proposal saying I want to write this book called The Beatles and the Avant-Garde, and look a lot at the more aesthetically challenging aspects of Beatles music. And of course, Yoko Ono plays a big role there as well. And they funded it. They gave the university's music library money to make purchases at my request. So I was able to say, I want these dozen books and these dozen CDs and these dozen DVDs. And that research culminated with the publication of my first book, The Beatles and the Avant-Garde, in November of 2014. And since then, I've taken it in any number of further directions to the point where it's now my full-time job. It's all I do every day.
Well, I appreciate you taking some free time on the weekend to continue to pursue your job, right? But they tell you, you're right. Like I'm a firm believer that if you do what you're passionate about, then you never work a day in your life. So
yeah, I heard that, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, because yes, it's a lot of fun, but man, is it a lot of work. It's so much work.
Yeah. So let's go with that. The title of your first book is The Beatles and the Avant-Garde.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting way to phrase that to me, because when I think of the avant-garde, I mean, it's a French term meaning advanced guard.
Right.
And it's kind of like interpreted as something like cutting edge or new or innovative. So you're almost giving it like its own identity, and you're saying that there's the Beatles and there's the avant-garde, and how they used that, right? And that a lot of people, maybe the younger generation, right, and the millennials and stuff like that, who didn't get to kind of see all that. That's even was before my generation. I'm 44, but some of the questions or things that are asked are kind of like, what, why were the Beatles so popular? What was it that they did that kind of was different, right? So I could see the book, like the Beatles using the avant-garde, to kind of propel to this realm that they were in. But you would have a better perspective as to their approach to that. Like, did they, what was going on? I mean, at the time that they were getting ready to kind of launch and take the world by storm, they were in Liverpool, and this is this kind of post-World War, like, area, and there was probably, like, that area was probably ready for change. They
very
were
much so.
Yeah, right. So they're kind of at this point where they just needed something or somebody or some band, whatever, an artist to kind of liberate them out of this hole.
Yeah, and I go into that in the book a little bit, how the avant-garde movement is kind of trying to knock high art with a capital H and a capital A off of its pedestal, because there's that kind of public perception of high art being glorious and profound and wonderful, and avant-garde artists like Yoko Ono wanted to knock that down and say, art doesn't have to be put on a pedestal. You can make it about everyday things. So one of Yoko's pieces that attracted John Lennon is a piece called Apple. She just puts an apple out and lets it decay over weeks and months, and that's the piece. And the point is that it's every day. There's nothing special about this apple compared to any other apple. It's just what happens. That's part of everyday life. And that really resonated with John Lennon, because the Beatles were also put up on a pedestal, and people thought of them as gods. And they're spectacular musicians, of course, arguably the greatest of the previous century, but they're still people. They're still guys. And so all the things like letting his hair grow long, like in the late 60s and into the early 70s, letting his hair grow long, not bathing, all of that is trying to knock that godlike perception, knock the Beatles off of their perceived pedestal. And it's a big reason why John Lennon was so interested in Yoko, both artistically and romantically.
So am I understanding it correctly then, that it wasn't the Beatles in its infancy who thought of themselves as avant-garde, or hey, we're gonna come up with a sound that's new and innovative and different? Did they use the avant-garde philosophy at the end of their, I don't want to say the end of their career, but when they got to, to break through Beatlemania? And the reason I asked that is because so the outline of how I outlined your book was, Beatlemania is created. Artistically, they become locked, pressure created, false image, too big to fail. What does an artist do? They got to destroy it, right? Because to me, creativity is kind of spawned through the struggle, the times that you're in. And did the Beatles use avant-garde to break through Beatlemania, or did they use avant-garde to propel them to Beatlemania? And then I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah. Well, the Beatlemania comes first, to a certain extent. Anyway, the extreme popularity started in the States in '64 and in Britain in '63, and John discovers Yoko. They meet Yoko in 1966, but John doesn't commit to her until 1968. So towards the end of the Beatles' career, the Beatles broke up in 1970, and so the Beatlemania years are the early to mid '60s, and then the more experimental avant-garde stuff comes after Beatlemania. And for the Beatles, in many ways, fame bought freedom. The fact that Beatlemania existed meant that anything they did would sell just because it was the Beatles. And so if John and Yoko's first avant-garde album is called Two Virgins, and it famously features them completely nude on the cover, and it sold. It actually charted in the United States, not in England, but in the States. That album charted because it didn't matter what music was on there. What matters is it was John Lennon, and people would buy it just because it's John Lennon. So the Beatlemania comes first. And with that fame and fortune comes the artistic freedom to then experiment with more aesthetically challenging artwork, such as Yoko introduced.
Hence the word challenging, because there is some school of thought to where it's harder to create when you have everything, right? Like you conclude in your book, or in the conclusion, that when they were financially secure and they kind of, in a sense, had everything, they were then free to create what they wanted, or the next version of them, which is interesting because in other forms of artistic expression, the wolf climbing the mountain is hungrier than the wolf on top. Meaning, if you're given everything, it's harder to create because you no longer struggle to express. And
I think there's something to that. Absolutely.
It's interesting, though, that you claim that your stance is that it was when they had that security that they were able to kind of blossom, into kind of like the next level, which is extremely hard to do and would kind of constitute them as masters of their craft.
Yeah, it's so funny with any sort of artistic discipline that anytime you come up with a rule, you can pretty much always come up with a counterexample to that rule. So what you're saying of if you're hungry, if you're striving for success, then you're going to work harder than someone who already has achieved success. And that in many ways that is true, but in many ways the precise opposite is also true, because when the Beatles finally become rich and famous, then they get hungry for something else. They had done the fame and fortune thing that really culminates with A Hard Day's Night in summer of 1964. That's what I consider the culmination of their early youth-centric period. And then after A Hard Day's Night, they really start to mature as recording artists. I often call this phase artistic adolescence, because it's where they grow up, where they turn from super teeny bopper superstars into the foremost musical artists of their time. But then they're not content with that either. Then they constantly find new ways, new artistic avenues, and that's when they enter psychedelia, and drugs start to really influence their music. And that's where you get albums like Revolver in '66 and Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour in '67. Yeah. So that's another thing that makes the Beatles so great, is that they, as soon as they reached a new peak, as soon as they're that top wolf on the mountain, like to use your metaphor, as soon as that happens, they say, okay, well, we've done this mountain. Let's go find another mountain and work our way up that mountain. Then they climb to that mountain. Well, where's the next mountain? And it's just constant. They're never satisfied. They never repeat themselves, as opposed to, say, the Beach Boys. Now, I love the Beach Boys music. I've listened to it extensively. I'm not an expert the way I am on the Beatles, but I did work at Ravinia for 2 summers. That's the Chicago music festival in Highland Park, north of Chicago. And the Beach Boys play there every year. And do they play new songs? No, they play songs that were popular 50 years ago. And they're kind of stuck in that artistic rut. They can never break out of that because that's their identity. Well, the Beatles never let that happen, because as soon as they got to the top of that mountain, they looked for something else. They didn't bask in their glory of staying on top of that mountain and just kind of recycle ideas that they had already used. They're constantly looking for new ideas and new ways to create music. And dare I say, the Beatles pull that off better than any other band in pop music history.
You know, why do you think that is? Because I agree that they are unique in that they were able to excel at a point where some artists, even masters, right, at that level, experts, however you want to term it, could start to stagnate, because
Yes.
it is a challenging time, right? You do have everybody's attention. It almost feels like no matter what you put out,
Yep.
will be considered golden. I can take a picture of an apple and put it up there and shit. Thank God they didn't have social media back then, because who knows how that would have grown. And I'm sure Chris is probably just like chomping at the bit as soon as I said that, right? But you know, it's going back to what I was saying, like it's challenging to be at that level and still create art and do it. You know, success is different to everybody, right? Like how you do, and if it's wealth, if wealth means money or quality of life, you know, like I think of myself as somewhat of a musician, right? So success would be like the expression of your art through, like, you know, musical talent. And it, you know, like I applaud the fact that they were able to do that when they kind of had everything. And, you know, was it in your opinion, like, was it the 4 band members and their, you know, their individualness that compelled them to be able, or that allowed them to do that? Or was it kind of everything? Was it just gigantic, you know, melting pot, or this big kind of brew that the whole world what kind of was in the 60s, and it just kind of was all laid out there for them?
It's a really good question, and I really wish I could definitively answer that, but I'm not sure I or anybody, frankly, ever will be able to definitively answer that question. It's the same debate that's existed for centuries. You know, is it the artist that creates the times, or is it the times that creates the artists? And you know, it's the same nature versus nurture. Well, the answer is both. The question is to what extent, and that's different for seemingly everybody out there. So I'm not really sure I can answer that. I'm not really sure anybody can definitively answer that.
Well, try. Give it a shot, man. Like what build me a timeline. You know, like Liverpool, what was it? Where are we at? Like the 50s? They're in like what's the socio-economic kind of culture like then? And how did that drive the Beatles to come out, to burst on the scene? Let's start from there.
Well, getting back to you know, the World War II thing that we were mentioning earlier, it's after World War II, even though the Allied forces won, I mean, England was in bad shape, much worse so than the United States. So the 50s are an economically prosperous time on one hand, but at the same time, it's still a major struggle for England. And the fact that they then go to Germany, they go to Hamburg in August of 1960, and to have an English band going to a German a nightclub and playing is slightly odd. It's always struck me as odd that the two enemies in the greatest conflict in world history would that an English band would go to Germany, or later on, or that John Lennon would marry a Japanese woman, the other major Allied force. So it does strike me as a little bit odd, but I at the same time there's that sense of renewal, of wanting to start fresh. After such a traumatic experience like World War II, there's a sense of wanting to start over again, to build from the ground up. So rock and roll in general, and the Beatles in particular, are kind of starting that new chapter in world history. Now, I don't know if I'm actually answering your question here, or if I'm just kind of rambling off the top of my head, but it does seem like both. Yeah, it does seem like, popular music is
the map. We're building the map. We're trying to figure it out. I think that's awesome, man. I mean, you got an English band, like you said, going to Germany, right? And Lennon, Mary, and Yoko, like you're seeing like these walls come down. Now Lennon didn't marry Yoko like at the infancy of their career.
No, that was March of '69, so at the very end of the Beatles' career.
But it seems like it seems like in Europe, in England, like they just got through this great war, and now like people are ready, right? And they're ready for these walls to come down, these stereotypes, like I've studied some wars, and I know some people who have, some soldiers and guys who have fought in wars, and the first thing they'll tell you is you're kind of taught to like dehumanize your enemy. They aren't human, it makes you easier to kill them if you don't view them as humans. So I'm sure that was strong in that area. So now that's starting to come down. People are kind of loosening up on their values, and their minds are starting to open. And here's this band, right, that's starting to kind of like connect these dots.
Yeah, and brings the world together again. Like,
is it their look? Is it the music they're playing? Like, what do you think drew? Like, what allowed them to cross those boundaries? Or could it have been any band? Could it have been you and I doing it? Or was it them in particular because of what? Because of, like I said, the way they looked? Was it their sound? What do you think?
Well, I think it's all of the above. But I think the single biggest factor in the Beatles' success is that they balanced two things very well. First, accessibility, because Beatles music is very easy to like. It's very catchy, it's very memorable, it's very melodic. It compels you to dance and to sing along to the music. And so on one hand, they're very accessible. On the other hand, the music is quite sophisticated. And popular music in general can be rather simplistic. Now, simplistic doesn't mean bad. You can have simple music that's really good, just like you can have simple music that's not so good. But what the Beatles do is give complex music that is also accessible. And so there are other bands, such as Yes. The band Yes is every bit as musically sophisticated as the Beatles. In fact, I have no problem saying Yes is more musically sophisticated than the Beatles, but they're nowhere near as accessible. Right? Yes is a harder nut to crack than the Beatles. Conversely, there are artists like Michael Jackson who are every bit as accessible. They're just as easy to like, but they're nowhere near as musically sophisticated. And so the Beatles balance that. They're both accessible and sophisticated in a way that very few other pop groups, if any, are able to balance those two things. So yes, certainly their looks, their Liverpudlian accents, all of that plays into it. But I think the single biggest reason why the Beatles were so successful and why they're still successful 50 years later is because of that balance between accessibility and sophistication.
And that allows them to kind of break down these cultural barriers. So now they're like growing in like the scene over there, and as that's stirring and their names are being talked to. We're at 7 minutes and 28 seconds right now. Like America. So what's America like then? What are they? How are they hearing what's going on, and what's the times like in America? They're probably feeling pretty good, right? Or the reason I say that is we probably looked at ourselves like we had won the war and we freed these, the tyranny and of Germany and all that kind of stuff. And but yet we were lacking something too. I mean, would you agree to that? And what was that? And what were the Beatles going to kind of save us from?
Yeah, that's a good segue to talk about my second book, which is called From the Shadow of JFK, The Rise of Beatlemania in America. And it looks at how Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963, set up the Beatles' success in just a few months later. And I have the book version. I have this as a presentation too that I just did 2 nights ago in LaSalle, Illinois. And I talk about how the Beatles had released 3 singles in the United States prior to Kennedy's death, and all 3 of them flopped. But then they released a 4th single in December, the day after Christmas, 1963, and that would go on to be their first American #1 hit. That was I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so the obvious question is why? What is so different that allows the Beatles to succeed in early '64 after failing throughout all of 1963? And as it turns out, one of the major events in 20th century American history happened in between the Beatles' failures and success, and that's Kennedy's assassination. And so many authors have speculated about a relationship between Kennedy's downfall and the Beatles' ascent. And it's often called the Kennedy rebound theory of Beatlemania, a term coined by author Candy Leonard, who wrote an excellent book called Beatleness a couple of years ago. So this Kennedy rebound theory says that America was sad after Kennedy died, and then the Beatles come along at the right time to make America happy again. And I've never really bought into that. That seems a little oversimplistic to me until I started researching Kennedy. And as it turns out, Kennedy had a strong appeal to young people, to adolescents and teenagers, just like the Beatles did. And so I don't think Kennedy meant to do this, but I believe what happened is that Kennedy essentially primed the market for the Beatles' success. I would argue that Kennedy's life and death could hardly have better prepared the United States for the Beatles' arrival and their success. So yes, I do think there's something to the Kennedy rebound theory. I mean, certainly Kennedy's death did make the United States sad, and the Beatles did make the United States happy. But I think more profound and more meaningful and more fundamental is that both the president and the band were leaders of youth culture. In other words, the same forces that allowed Kennedy to succeed in the early 60s are the same forces that allow the Beatles to succeed just a few years later.
Absolutely. And before, now this kind of goes back to the discussion that Chris and I were having before you joined us. And I had said that as a human being, we search to identify with a group, and we may not understand what that group, like all the moving pieces behind it. We could support a group just based on like their claims, the outer shell of their claims, and deep down it could be some hideous kind of monster, right? Like we could support a group that has something negative in its agenda, but we feel we need to identify with something that allows us to kind of propel us to the next step of our life. And it sounds like that's exactly the case, right? Like the youth, you know, kind of electing Kennedy, this younger kind of, you know, hipster kind of president who spoke differently and dated movie stars and this and that.
Right, Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, and then at the same time, is ready to embrace like Beatlemania coming over because we need that as human beings. Like we feel we need that, or we need something like that, and this could be it, you know.
Well, Kennedy's assassination certainly left a raw hole in the nation's collective consciousness. One of the Kennedy biographies that I read was called "A Life Unfinished," I believe was the subtitle, and so my argument, and not everybody agrees with my interpretation, but my argument is that the Beatles fulfilled Kennedy's promises. You know, what Kennedy represented in abstract political philosophy, the Beatles take those same youth-centric values and turn it into music and into a few inches of vinyl disc that can be purchased and owned and played and listened to whenever you want.
I love it. We're down to 1:17, and this is great, man. Chris, what are you thinking? What are you feeling?
You know, listen, this is why we do this podcast, is to be able to sit down and listen and talk and have conversations with people like Aaron. And I've just been sitting here nodding my head. And I got to tell you, that voice, I could listen to you talk about anything all day long, my friend. That's what I have written in front of me. It says, that voice, my God. People, the millions listening, make sure you get to see Aaron Krerowicz live anytime you get the option. But saying all that, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then we'll cut back right in, all right? Is that cool with everyone?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. What's up, everybody? This is Chris from the BrahjCast, and I just want to remind all the millions of listeners out there to go ahead and stop on by www.haleyspaghetti.com and go ahead and see what the fuck I'm all about. Because not only am I the world's greatest up-and-coming podcaster of his generation, I'm also a budding author. And I ran out of my plug time 25 seconds ago, but fuck it, I'm the producer of this show, so I gives no shits. I will give my listeners a synopsis. Just imagine Harry Potter getting his ass whooped by a 10-year-old girl. Blam. Mind blown. Welcome to Knowledge Bomb University. And back to the podcast.
BrahjCast commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We pretty much left off in the JFK era, so
Right.
I don't really know how to just say go ahead and go, but like I was telling my brother, I was certainly, I'm really enjoying listening to all this stuff, because I don't know a whole lot about the Beatles, so it's really good to get a very unique and very fairly expert perspective on the whole thing. What I did, hey, no problem, and thank you for being here. But what I did, take a few. I took a lot of notes, but what I wanted to say when you brought up that the Beatles had went to Germany, in a time after some wars and stuff like that. Right. It just resonated with me that shows you. I'm just such a big believer in music, all sorts of music, all kinds of music, and the power of music, and for lack of better words, that like music is love, and love is borderless, and thus music is borderless. And I just wanted to say that. I know that was like a half hour ago that you made that statement, but I just been sitting back here nodding my head, just agreeing with everything you've been saying. So, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've often heard the way I've often heard that said is that music is a universal language.
There it is.
And it can, regardless of what language you speak verbally, you can still understand music.
I agree. I feel like music I might sound stupid to the millions listening, but it's like I feel like my cells can listen to music. It goes deep within me. It's just like, but that's why I just feel like that's why people dance. It's just like it's just like your body's moving. Just music is so powerful. I'm also a big believer in the healing power of music, and not to say that if I cut my arm, I could play Sgt. Pepper and heal.
Right.
But
that'd be pretty cool if you could do that.
But like your harmonic, like your balance, like that's a whole nother ball of wax right there. But just the healing power of music, I think, played a big role with civilizations way prior to us. And it's still something that we see right in front of us every day. There's a reason. There's an absolute reason why music touches us and makes us feel the way we do and makes us dance, and that's special to me. That's special. It blows my mind. People can make music this day. This is 2017. Music's been around for so long, yet people can still come up with new beats and version. I don't know the correct terms, but they can still come up with like a new sound that I've never heard. Amongst all this music out there, you can still create new music, and that's amazing. But that's all I got to say about that. Forrest Gump. Just went on off a little tangent there, but I'm just such a big believer in music, and I'm threading that in and within my book series. I really am embedding, especially in book 2, is all about the power of music. And again, I think when I say that, the healing power of music, the untrained mind immediately thinks, oh, you broke your arm, you think you can listen to music and heal, but it's not that. It's deeper than that.
It's a psychological, a mental thing.
Exactly.
Not a physical thing.
Exactly. There's a reason music makes us feel the way we do, and there's nothing else except like drugs and hallucinogenics can make you make your body buzz, and you get that kind of when you're dancing and feeling. Because sometimes you listen to music, but sometimes you feel music. You feel it like.
Oh, sure.
Like in White Men Can't Jump, there's a famous line. He said, he's like, you're not listening. He's like, I can hear Jimmy. He's like, no, you don't hear it. You're just listening to it.
That reminds me of a quote from Charles Ives, who's a 20th century American composer. He said, "Don't focus too much on the notes because you might miss the music."
Boom.
Absolutely. Boom. Reminds me of a quote, "Don't miss the forest for the trees."
Yes.
Oof, yes.
But so we're kind of getting us back in this timeline we're creating.
Yeah.
The first segment kind of ended at like this, the culmination of like what the Beatles were doing. Maybe culmination is not the right word, but what was brewing in England over there. The stage is set for the United States. Kennedy was assassinated. The world's kind of caught in this unique kind of like limbo. Like they don't know what to do, who to listen to, who to follow.
The leader of the free world had just been killed. Now where do we go?
Violently. Conspiracy theories are going through the roof.
Yes.
Right? Like it talk about like chaos, like it reminds me of one of my like favorite like kind of psychologists I like to listen to, Jordan Peterson. He's big on like the human history, and it's like we go through these cycles. It's like order, corruption, chaos, order, corruption, chaos, right? And here we are like in chaos around this time, and we're getting ready to kind of go into the next segment, which would be order, and whatever that is, right? It doesn't have to be world peace. It just means like the next kind of path laid for a specific society. In this case, it's the United States of America. So the Beatles are on their plane flying into New York to do the Ed Sullivan Show, right? I mean, that's the timeline. Like they came in, and that was going to be, people are like, who are these people? Or did they kind of have an idea of the band, or what's the buzz? What are they feeling as this Ed Sullivan Show is getting ready to air?
Yeah,
and tell me what the Ed Sullivan Show is, because I'm an idiot. Like I know what it is, I've heard of it, but bring me into that conversation too. Set that up for me too, please.
Sure. Yeah. So the the Beatles fly from Heathrow in London to JFK, the recently renamed JFK International Airport in New York, on February 7th, 1963. So we're talking just a couple months after Kennedy's death. And they're scheduled to play the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th. Now, Ed Sullivan was I guess he's most famous for his own TV show, but he would often invite musical acts. Elvis Presley famously was on. In fact, the second time I believe Elvis was on, they refused to show him from the waist down on the Ed Sullivan Show. They only showed him from the waist up. There's a book that I haven't actually read it all the way through, but it's called Sundays with Sullivan, and it's all about all the different musical acts, and not just musical acts, but all the different people that Ed Sullivan had on his shows. Now, the Beatles are certainly the most famous, and Elvis probably would be right up there too. But there were hundreds of guests, and so this book, Sundays and Sullivan, goes into a lot of detail about that, which is a big reason I want to read it. I've read little bits and pieces, but I want to sit down and read the whole thing. Anyway, so at the time, in February of '64, there's really only a couple of TV channels. Now, in the 21st century, we have cable with the hundreds and hundreds of channels.
Right.
And that wasn't the case, 53 years ago. You only had a few options to choose from. And so Sunday night, seemingly everybody would sit down and watch the Ed Sullivan Show. And so our grandmother, Carol Krerowicz, has told me that when on that day she wanted to watch, not because it was the Beatles, but because it was Ed Sullivan. Now, the younger people at the time would have gone for the Beatles, because the Beatles have explode in very late '63 and very early '64, and Ed Sullivan is often thought of as the defining moment for Beatlemania in America. And so they do in February of '64 they do 3 shows, 3 consecutive Sundays, where they play I believe it's 2 sets in each of those 3 shows. And the report is that 73.7 million people tuned in on February 9th of '64 to watch the Beatles debut on Ed Sullivan. Jeez. So that is like the defining moment for Beatlemania in America. Now, what's really curious is that that date, that show, Ed Sullivan Show, is often thought of as the start of Beatlemania. And in America, that there's something to that. But if you count up the number of days in Beatles history, if you count the day John and Paul met for the first time, which was July 6th, 1957, and if you count if you count that as day 1, and if you count the last day as April 10th, 1970, when Paul McCartney announced the breakup of the band, then Ed Sullivan comes approximately 52% of the way through Beatles history. So, in other words, Ed Sullivan comes more than halfway through Beatles history. It's not the beginning. It's more than halfway over by the time the Beatles play on Ed Sullivan. So yes, in the States, it is often regarded as the start of Beatlemania. But when you look at the larger picture, the Beatles were more than half over at the time they played that show.
And here, I totally agree. I mean, he might have just provided a platform kind of launch them in the States. And who knows, man? I mean, maybe there was a big like internal war in the U.S. of who would be the first to kind of provide this like airtime to kind of introduce them to, you know, the younger culture in the U.S. in like a turbulent time. But so they come in and it's like boom, man, like pow, everybody's heads explode. They're ready. They're like, this is what we've been looking for, right? Like they jump on the bandwagon. They identify with everything, because I mean, what would be some of the, like, what was the music like then?
Oh, my thoughts exactly.
Early 60s, Christ, that, you know, who would be like,
is this
the
Chuck
Beatles
Berry?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Like I'm struggling to kind of find something who I can compare them with, and I want to show like a difference, right? Like the culture being like, hey, we're gonna jump on with these guys because they're new and they're different. So there has to be something to compare them to. Chuck Berry,
Sure.
Elvis.
Well, what were like the top 10 songs, like the years prior to the Beatles even being?
Like that.
Yeah.
Do you know that
really
answer?
It's really fascinating how this all plays out, because in the 50s in America, you have rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, the Everly Brothers, right? All these major and very forward-thinking musical acts who helped define the genre of 50s rock and roll. But then, for a variety of reasons, by the end of the 50s, they've all stopped recording. Chuck Berry's arrested for violating the Mann Act, which
never
ironically titled
the Mann Act.
Yes, the ironically titled Mann Act, MANN, named after the man who passed the legislation. But the gist of it, get this, the gist of the Mann Act says you cannot transport minors across state boundaries for immoral purposes.
Oh, pretty loosely worded there.
So the girl was 16. She told Chuck Berry she was 18. Well, that argument does not hold up in a court of law, and Chuck Berry went to jail. Elvis Presley joined the military. In March of '58, he joins the army, and that he would, of course, have a comeback afterwards. But in many ways, his prime years were ended when he joined the armed forces. Then who else? I'm blanking. Little Richard joins the ministry. He actually sees Sputnik in I think it was '58. The Russians launched Sputnik, and Little Richard saw it and didn't realize what it was. He thought it was a sign from God that he had to renounce his sinful rock and roll lifestyle and instead pursue a life in ministry. And so all of these major contributors to 1950s rock and roll are no longer producing by the start of the new decade.
Oh.
Instead, what you get are acts like The Singing Nun, whose song Dominique was a #1 in December of 1963. And you go on YouTube and look up Dominique by The Singing Nun, and you'll laugh hysterically because it's so tame compared to Elvis or even the Beatles. And so when the Beatles do show up, they kind of reinvigorate the American popular music scene. They bring back some of the potency of rock and roll, which had been missing from the American Billboard charts for some years, going back to the late 50s and into the early 60s.
Yeah, I'm looking at the list of like the top 10 around that time. We got Save the Last Dance for Me from the Drifters.
Yes. Oh,
right.
darling.
You from Elvis. The Twist from Chubby Checker.
Chubby Checker, sure.
Only the Lonely from Roy Orbison.
Yep.
Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny.
Oh, yeah. Who can forget?
Highland. So, you know, it's what's cool is, To me, rock and roll is like if you and Aaron, I'm pretty sure you'll agree with this. Like,
Yeah.
the rock and roll kind of like all the chords are kind of like blues scales, just played differently. So it's not like the Beatles brought. It's not like they reinvented the wheel, so to say, as far as like blues / rock and roll, kind of the way the chords and the scales are played. But maybe it was, like you had said earlier in the last segment, it was kind of everything. And I think that's what we're kind of driving home in this segment is like it really was everything, wasn't it? It was their look. It was the times in both countries, both continents. It was the way they played their music because, every single Beatles song wasn't kind of a faster scale, like an E blues scale. They had some of the slower beats and tempos, and what else? What am I missing as far as like the wow factor that they brought?
Yeah, I have a program called The Influence of American Rock and Roll on the Beatles. And it just so happens I did it last night in DeKalb, Illinois. And the fundamental conclusion, it's a 90-minute program. And at the very end of it, my fundamental conclusion is that both 50s rock and roll and 60s rock were revolutionary genres, meaning they both articulated change, but they did so in very different ways. So 50s rock and roll is primarily a social revolution because the music itself is quite simple. Now, that's not to say it's bad. It's exactly what it needs to be, but it typically uses 3 chords and a relatively simple melody. There's not much musical sophistication. And in that sense, the music of 50s rock and roll is really the vehicle for social change. And by social, I mean racial. Rock and roll brought together white and black America. And generational, because it built up the so-called generation gap. The young people of the time were rebelling against the older generations of the time. And both of those things, the racial and generational barriers, are more important to rock and roll than the actual music. The music is the way those social barriers were raised and broken down. But in the 60s, and the Beatles are perhaps the prime example, it is a musical revolution, much more so than a social revolution. And so the Beatles will use different keys in, for example, A Day in the Life, the concluding track of Sgt. Pepper. The verses are in G major, the bridge or the middle 8 is in E major. So it's 2 different tonalities at work in the same song. And that's something that I don't believe Elvis Presley or Buddy Holly or Little Richard or Chuck Berry ever did in their songs. Now, I can't say that for sure because I haven't studied them to the same extent. So I don't quote me on that. But I don't believe they ever used different keys in the same song. That's a rather sophisticated thing to do. And the Beatles do it relatively frequently. About 1/3, and maybe closer to 1/4 of the Beatles songs modulate or change keys. And so that helps establish a more sophisticated musical palette in 60s rock and in Beatles music in particular than what we find in the 50s. And so that's what I mean when I say they're both revolutionary, but in different ways. 50s rock and roll is more social, is more of a social revolution. 60s rock is more of a musical revolution.
And it provides like the path for them to kind of take the world by storm, take the United States by storm. Everybody buys into it. There's a big craze. Mm-hmm. And now how do you use avant-garde, right? Because now, per like your book, your first book, you define avant-garde at the beginning in the introduction. Uh-huh. And it's, it's new and innovated. But now, after a couple of years, it's not new anymore, and that's the double-edged sword. So I know we talked a little bit about this, but in the first segment of the show, but now we're getting into like the challenge for any artist, and I can see this in other bands who have put together a lengthy kind of resume of albums, and I can see the change, and some people kind of cry sellout when certain bands kind of change their style, their approach. But like, let's talk a little bit about, let's go down that road. Like, did they start pursuing the psychedelics and the drugs to enable them to go to the next level? Like, from the little I know of like Sgt. Pepper, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they almost took on new personas, and like what you see Stephen King write books as Richard Bachman, right? To create this new thing, like this new approach. He actually turns himself into another persona to write a certain way. Like, you think that's what the Beatles approach was to Sgt. Pepper, to kind of launch them into the next level, and the drugs kind of play a huge part of that?
I would say very much so, because if you're familiar with the Beatles' first film, A Hard Day's Night, the opening scene shows John Lennon, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison all running frantically from mobs of screaming fans. But Paul is able to hide in plain sight by putting on fake facial hair, a fake beard and mustache. And so essentially what happens is he is able to lead a normal life by putting on a disguise. And 3 years later, they would do the same thing for the entire band. Not just Paul is in disguise, the entire band, the Beatles, is in disguise. So they're no longer the Beatles, they're Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, of course, in real life, it is the Beatles. But the idea, much like Stephen King, is to get outside of themselves, put on a disguise, and thereby liberate yourselves. You're no longer bound by being the Beatles. There's a quote from Paul that I will paraphrase. It's something like, you don't have to write the song that you want to write. You could write the song that they want to write. And so it's all about getting outside of yourselves and thinking in new ways. And I suspect drugs played a big part in that as well.
Yeah, I love the fact that they did that, because I can't think of another artist or band who did something similar. And maybe there are, I'm drawing a blank right now.
I'm sure there are, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, and listening, and as I kind of finished my last statement, and then you kind of took off with it and provided some clarity to it, I started thinking, like, man, like, I wonder, when people think of the 60s and in the later part of the 60s, they think of like hippies and this drug movement and Woodstock and this and that. And I wonder if could you dare say that the Beatles kind of influenced that whole kind of culture? Not that they're responsible for drug use, but kind of influenced, like, thinking outside of the box. Like, I want to say, like, put a mask on, but that might not be the right term, right? Like, the term isn't hide from who you are because of for some negative reason. It would be like in order to go to the next creative level, become a different part of yourself, to open up some door in your mind. And just saying that out loud kind of sounds like very psychedelic, very hippie-ish.
It does, yeah.
Me not being from that generation, like, I wonder if like the Beatles influenced that whole culture to take that step, or if it was the other way around. Like, the Beatles didn't invent drugs, right? So, I mean, it wasn't like, yeah. So, like, was was the whole industry kind of moving towards that, and they just kind of were part of it, you know, like it's an interesting rabbit hole to maybe kind of pursue.
Yeah. And I think this will have to be the last discussion point, just because I've got to get home. I'm actually at a friend's house over for dinner. But yeah, I do think that, again, it's the nature versus nurture. You know, does society create the artist? Does the artist create society? And it's both. I mean, the world was headed in that direction, and the Beatles were certainly contributing to that. Paul gave an interview, I think in '67, maybe it was '68, in which he was asked, "Have you ever taken LSD?" And Paul said, "Well, you're asking me, so I'm going to give you an honest answer. Yes, I did, and I enjoyed it, and I think it made me a better person." And he would go on in that interview to say, "Look, if you don't want people to know that I've taken LSD, then don't print it, right? You're doing this interview, just don't just take this out, edit it out." But he said something like, "I'm not going to censor myself, but if you want to censor me, that's your choice." And by 2017 standards, that seems kind of naive. I mean, of course, the press is going to print lurid stories and whatnot, and so the Beatles certainly contributed to the direction that the world was going in terms of drug use and drug abuse. But I think had Paul not admitted to LSD, and had the Beatles not experimented in drugs, it probably would have headed that way anyway.
Yeah. And look, I appreciate your time. If we could end, I think we walked through this whole timeline and answered my initial question beautifully, right? Like, we made a damn good attempt to answer my question, like as far as what their success was deemed upon and how influential they were. But like, now you're going in front of these audiences, and you might have like some of the older generation and some of the newer ones. Like, what are like 2 points that you feel compelled to kind of drive home? And let's take it from the younger perspective, because people listening to this are going to be in their early 20s. Like, what do you want them to know about the influence of the Beatles on American culture or world culture?
Sure. Well, I have to admit that despite all of that, the accolades, all of the adulation that the Beatles do receive and have received, in spite of all that, I think the Beatles' music is actually underappreciated. I don't think many people really understand just how influential and how revolutionary this band was. And looking at popular music today in the 21st century, there are very few, if any, current recording artists who were not in some way influenced by what the Beatles did. Seemingly everything they did. Now, granted, the Beatles used tape, right? Analog, magnetic tape to make their records. And now, of course, everything is digital. Right. But nevertheless, a lot of the techniques that the Beatles used and pioneered are still used today. Even though the medium is different, even though it's digital rather than analog, the techniques are often still the same, which is to say things like experimental recordings. For example, the song Good Morning, Good Morning, which is the third to last track on Sgt. Pepper, uses close mic'd brass. And so the engineers actually inserted the microphone into the bells of the instruments, into the resonating chambers of the instruments. And that's how you get the really harsh, aggressive, distorted sound of those brass instruments on that recording. And that kind of experimentalism, of willingness to try new things, and it won't always work, but the thought of even just trying it is still very present today. Now, the technology, of course, very different, but the fundamental adventurous spirit and experimental enthusiasm for experimentation is still very much around today.
Well, Aaron, again, I thank you for your time. I know you're a busy man and you got to go. So is there any websites, or where can people find you and learn more about you and your information?
Sure, yeah. The best way is through my website, which is just myname.com. However, my last name is unpronounceable. So the best way is to just do a Google search for Aaron Beatles Scholar, and I'll be the first thing to come up. So that has all my information, my full upcoming events, all my speaking engagements. I'm going off on, I just finished 1 month of a lecture tour. I've got 3 more months that take me until about Thanksgiving. So if you live in the United States and you're listening, and then I will likely be coming somewhere near you.
Hey, Aaron, I wanted to say thanks a lot for your time too, and also I totally get it now because I just YouTubed the singing nun, Dominique, and I understand the void that needed to be filled in music at that time. But thanks to the internet, it does become beautiful sometimes. Somebody has remixed it, dubstep and hardcore, and the song actually sounds pretty good. I might download it.
I'm gonna have to go listen to that one. I haven't heard that one yet.
Yeah, YouTube Dominique remix hardcore, and might blow your mind.
Dominique remix hardcore. I'm gonna look that one up.
Awesome, but hey, thanks again, Aaron. Yeah, maybe we can have you on again because this was awesome.
Oh, I'd love to. Absolutely.
Cool.
I'd love
cool.
to.
I really enjoy, there's more to talk about than the Beatles, but I totally enjoyed this ride, and I want to get your views and opinions on a lot of other things too in the future.
Oh, very good. I'm not sure I have worthwhile views or opinions on anything other than the Beatles.
I don't care. I just want to hear you talk, man. That's all it is. And then millions and millions of people are going to want to hear it too, brother.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you both again. And hopefully we'll see you maybe around Christmas.
There it is.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
All right, buddy. Thanks.
Thanks, and good night.
All right, everybody. That's it. That's episode 2 of the BrahjCast. Just want to thank all the millions of listeners out there that continue to make us the #1 trending show on YouTube. Guys, gals, we thank you. The BrahjCast cannot show our appreciation enough for all the clicks, the likes, the shares, the subscribes. It all helps us. It helps us continue to bring the greatest content to your ears. Next week, my brother and I are going to interview a real-life motherfucking witch. What? Where else are you going to hear something like this? I didn't think so. It's the BrahjCast. Yeah. Later, guys.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.